It's a 7:30 p.m. Welcome, everyone. All right, 7:45 p.m. Welcome, everyone. Attending both in person and online. I'm Kristen Lindquist. I'm a member of the Monhegan Associates Ecology Committee, and I'm going to be your MC tonight.
Sing out, please.
Yeah. So before we start, I want to thank the Monhegan Associates for sponsoring the ecology lectures. For those who might not know, the Monhegan Associates is the Inland Land Trust. And if you've hiked a trail here, you can thank the Monhegan Associates, and you can thank them even more by giving a donation in the donation jar or taking an envelope home. Thank you to the Ecology Committee for organizing the lecture series, of which this is the first one of 4 we have planned for you. I'll read the list of what's coming up at the end of this talk. Thank you to Claire Durst for helping coordinate so we can have participants online. And a big thank you to all of you for who are attending. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for being here or being online. It's your support that makes these lectures possible. And to donate, if you're home and you want to donate, go to monheganassociates.org and click on the donate button. We are a nonprofit and we're supported by donations. So before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to let you know we've muted everybody on Zoom, but if you have questions, we'll be taking questions after the talk. If you're online, put them in the chat. And if you're here, we're going to take live questions first, and then we will get to the questions in the chat. So type in your questions and we will get to you. And so now I want to introduce Susie Arnold. She's the senior ocean scientist at the Island Institute, where she focuses on the impacts of climate change on fisheries and fishing communities. Her current work includes helping coastal communities better understand the implications of ocean climate change so they can make informed adaptation decisions. She's an appointee to the Maine Climate Council and co-chair of the Climate Council's Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. Susie earned master's degrees in marine biology and marine policy and a doctoral degree in marine biology from the University of Maine. She's going to talk to us tonight about several ocean climate change stressors we are faced with here on the Maine coast, and how communities and private businesses are taking action, and probably most importantly, how to remain hopeful in the face of everything that's going on. So please help me welcome Susie Arnold.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction and the invitation to be here. And thank you all for your patience with the technical difficulties. We're just getting back into the swing of having in-person meetings, I guess. That was a first for me that has happened. But in any case, I wanted to say a special thank you to Tish Miller and Candace Cousins, the co-chairs of the Monhegan Ecology Committee, for inviting me here tonight. I very much appreciate it, and I'm honored to be here. I also just wanted to take a minute to introduce Kim Hamilton, who is our new president at the Island Institute. We're thrilled to have her as part of our team, and she's joining us this evening and tomorrow on Monhegan for the first time, right, Kim?
First time.
So yes, very exciting for everybody. So as the senior ocean scientist at the Island Institute and as a member of the Maine Climate Council and the co-chair of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, I'm often asked to give talks about the state of ocean climate change in Maine. And this usually involves some fairly heavy, rather depressing topics about sea level rise, ocean warming, ocean heat waves, invasive species. Not a lot of good news. And so what I'm challenged with tonight is to share the information with you, and also to focus on something that I don't think we focus on quite enough, which is hope and action that we can take to reverse that negative trend. So I'm going to start, hopefully, any more technical difficulties here. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to actually start with the psychology of hope. Now, I am not a behavioral psychologist at all, so bear with me. But it turns out that hope is more than just a feeling. It is a healing agent, and it is a science. And it entails 3 primary components: goals, agency thinking, and pathways thinking. So to break it down, it starts with goal setting. So importantly, hope is more than just optimism. If you take away, it's really about action. If you take away the pathways thinking, it's simply wishful thinking. And so it's more than just a feeling. It's more than just optimism. It's actually being able to do something about something that you care about. So in my role, so basically you have to have a meaningful goal. You have to have agency or the knowledge to determine and the determination that gives you the confidence that you can achieve that goal. And then you have to have the pathways thinking, which is the willingness to tweak your plan. And so I challenge myself tonight to serve the role as a hope giver for you all. And so I built a goal, and that is to motivate you to take action because the things that you value are at risk, whether it's marine life or your coastal community. I believe that I'm capable of achieving this goal because of my training, because of the research that I conduct, and frankly, because I have a lot of practice at it. Number three, I have a plan, and that includes using multiple methods of science translation to learn what resonates with people, and hone in on what's most effective in helping you to take action. So the psychology literature that I reviewed discussed how trauma, fear, and rumination can rob someone of hope. Now, I haven't researched this, but I suspect that climate anxiety can also do the same. So I've read a little bit of Dr. Chan Hellman's work. He's the founding director of the Hope Research Institute at the center, at the Hope Research Institute Center at the University of Oklahoma at Tulsa. And he describes in a recent TED Talk that one of the single best predictors of hope is our connectedness with each other. And meaning that an important component to nurture hope is through social outlets, and that could be attending this talk tonight or engaging in your local climate action committee or what have you. But being connected with other people can help you remain hopeful. So now I'm going to transition by bringing your attention to another recent paper, and it's called Empowering Hope-Based Climate Change Communication Techniques for the Gulf of Maine. Who would have thought there's a publication about hope in the Gulf of Maine? So I was at the meeting that resulted from this publication, and I'm just going to read two pieces of the abstract for you, and then I'm going to give you an example of each of those pieces. So the first piece is, scientists, policymakers, and practitioners often want to communicate to the public about the seriousness of the situation to encourage mitigation and adaptation. Many standard communication strategies that rely on fear and scientific authority alone, rather than comprehensive explanations that include solutions, can leave audiences feeling overwhelmed and disengaged instead of hopeful and motivated to act. Next, I'm going to give you an example of such a communication piece. This is not a criticism. I was involved in creating this. This came out of the work of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. We updated the Maine Climate Council on the state of climate change in Maine in 2021. And so I'm going to read to you, not all 10, but a few indicators of how we're doing. And it says at the very top, grappling with these extreme events can feel overwhelming. And I'm just going to read bits and pieces. Driest period since 1895. Second warmest year on record for Maine. The Gulf of Maine had its warmest fall on record. Third warmest winter, December, January, and February. Temperature since 1895. Smoke from western state wildfires traversed the continent on the prevailing westerlies, reaching into Maine and degrading air quality. This also recently happened this week from Canadian wildfires. Sea levels were generally above average along the Maine coast through the end of the year. If that's not bad enough, let's top it off with pup and chick survival. This past year was 65% below the previous 17 years because of climate-related stressors. So these are facts. Maybe they motivate you, or maybe they cause you to feel despair, or maybe even apathy. Like, what can we do? This is all bad news. What can we possibly do about it? So the next piece of the abstract that I'd like to share with you from this paper it says this: communication models that involve the head, understanding of climate change, the heart, hope through agency and efficacy, and hands, intentions to participate in community action, further engagement in climate conversations. And so hopefully, if the technology allows, I'm going to give you an example of this type of climate communication. Bear with me. I'm going to switch over to a video somewhere. Hang on, here it is.
If you haven't felt the effects of climate change, you will.
It's changing the entire planet Earth. We live in a tiny place called Maine.
The natural resources that we have are what make Maine Maine. Live off it. We're fishermen, we're farmers, we're foresters. Who doesn't want to have a job where you can see this every day?
A lot of people see climate change as like, oh, this is, a problem for the next generation.
It is not a problem of tomorrow, it is a problem of today.
It has the impact of changing life as we know it.
When I was a kid, this might have happened once every 10 years. Now you can pretty much count on it happening every year.
We're seeing water on sections of roads that we hadn't seen before.
Drought, erratic frost dates, more extreme storms. The ski season changing, ice fishing season changing. All those things are changing right now. The thing about climate change is that it is directly threatening the things that we love about Maine. When I was a little kid and I would go out lobstering with my dad, he would just nail in lobsters hard.
I have traps I can show you that have stuff growing on them that I've never seen before.
The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans.
Climate change isn't just something that happens on the coast. This is not just about sea level rise. This is about, in our case, not enough water.
Seeing two moose out here. Moose can have between 30 to 90,000 ticks on them. When we recover that animal, it's lost 30% of its body weight and it's dead. And that's because of the impact of winter tick.
In Maine, transportation emissions are 54% of overall state emissions.
We've always had really strong farming and forestry and fishing industries. In order for those industries to continue to thrive, we need to focus on climate change now. We're writing a history right now for Maine that we will be ready. We're going to be a state leading.
Really important for climate change not to be seen as something that we have to pay for. It's also an opportunity for us to participate in the economy in a new way.
There's 1.3 million people in the state of Maine. There's only 6% of us that benefit from heat pumps.
Maine is setting an example for other states to set bold climate goals.
Buildings have to save energy to address climate change.
When we're up at full production, we're employing more than 100 people. Those are 100 good paying jobs in a community that is a couple thousand people. That has a multiplier effect that is massive.
This is one of the first community solar farms built in Rockford. Having a solar farm or wind power are going to allow us to increase our tax base, and we're going to keep that money here at home where it belongs.
Framing the climate crisis as a social issue rather than a scientific issue, especially for younger folks, is critical.
This feels like a team project where we all need to contribute. I felt like this was one way that I can make a difference.
We hope we can do something about it.
The next 10 years are really important. What Maine Won't Wait is trying to do is to say, here's what you can do about this. And by the way, they're going to help save you money. We're just trying to find common sense ways to help people take action. We are seeing businesses and towns follow the governor's lead. They're not waiting, and that's exciting. If we want to continue to have the state that we all love and cherish so much, we need to act now. Maine cannot wait.
That was an example of a communication that probably doesn't leave you feeling despair or apathy, hopefully. I think everyone's different, but so those are a couple different examples of different types of science communication. There again. How's that look?
Perfect.
Okay. Miracle. Okay, so I going to speak about, as you mentioned in the intro, 3 different climate stressors facing the Gulf of Maine. I'm going to talk about warming waters. I'm going to talk about ocean acidification, and I'm going to talk about sea level rise, but I'm not going to leave it at that. I'm also going to pair those stressors with some action that's happening here in Maine. So first, as you heard in the video, Maine, the Gulf of Maine is warming very rapidly. People used to say warming more rapidly than 99% of the world's oceans. We're not quite at that rate anymore, but we're still warming much more rapidly. And there's some good science showing why that is. So basically, changes in ocean circulation are a huge factor. Something called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation is being impacted by Arctic warming and ice melt from Greenland, and it's changing that whole circulation pattern, and it's resulting in the Gulf Stream shifting. And so just to orient you really quickly, here's Cape Cod, here's Nova Scotia, the Bay of Fundy, the Gulf of Maine. This is the Gulf Stream carrying warmer, saltier water up from the south. This is the Labrador Current carrying colder, fresher water down from Canada. And essentially what's happening is the Gulf Stream is shifting to the north and actually resulting in the retreat of the Labrador Current, and more warm water is entering through the Northeast Channel into the Gulf of Maine. So this is the reason why we're seeing such rapid warming. And we know this because we've been tracking sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Maine since back in the 1880s. This is annual average sea surface temperature from 1880 to current day. And these squiggly lines here are temperature projections out to about 2100 under different emission scenarios. The historical average since we've been measuring is 48.6 degrees. If you look at the latest 12-month average, you can see that we're almost 4 degrees Fahrenheit hotter in the last 12 months than the historical average. So very much able to track that warming trend. You look out to 2050, under the highest emission scenario, down East Maine coastal temperatures will be similar to southern New England temperatures today. Now, southern New England temperatures may sound nice for swimming, but they're drastically impacting marine species. In particular, the most obvious example is probably the Maine lobster fishery. So we can measure this, we can see it, you can talk to the lobstermen, and we were just speaking with the lobsterman from Monhegan, was telling us about the drastic changes that he in his lifetime have seen. This is a scientific illustration of that change, basically showing the changes in distribution and abundance as water temperature is warming. So basically the left panel is showing you back in 1972, the biomass of lobsters caught per scientific tow. The reds and the oranges are where a lot of lobsters are caught, and you can see lots of lobsters are being caught more in the southern New England, Cape Cod area. If you fast forward a few decades, oh, sorry, you can't see that. That's 2019. It's the same surveys done, and what you're finding is lobsters are being heavily caught down east and offshore, and that's directly correlated to that warming water we just talked about. We've also seen it in scientific studies that the Maine Department of Marine Resources conducts every year and has been for, well, these are going back to 2000. We're seeing lots of concerning declines across all of the sublegal surveys. So sublegal surveys means there's like 4 or 5 different sublegal surveys. And basically it's looking at those lobsters that are about to molt and will then be considered keepers. And so it's a way to kind of foreshadow the future of the fishery by looking at sublegal populations. And the bad news is that all of these surveys are trending in the same direction. They're all trending down, which is a note of caution for the Maine Department of Marine Resources. They're very much using these data to inform management today. So there's talk right now about increasing the minimum size here in Maine if we reach a certain trigger. And the reason for that is because these surveys of sublegals are showing downward trends and have been for several years now. So what can we do to address this problem? And what can lobstermen and the working waterfront businesses that depend on fisheries that are being impacted by warming waters do? Well, they can help to decarbonize the environment, and they are. And so I've taken you for this solution example to what we call our solutions library. We have it on the website of the Island Institute. You can check it out. There's all sorts of solutions of things that have worked to address kind of common problems, not just related to climate change, but kind of across the board, that address affordable housing, education, all sorts of problems that impact the Maine coast. There's examples. And so there on our website, we have 3 examples in our solutions library about how the working waterfront is helping to decarbonize their businesses. Mook Sea Farm, the Cranberry Isles Fishermen's Co-op, and Pendleton Yacht Services. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the Cranberry Isles Fishermen's Co-op have done. This is a co-op made of lobstermen off the coast of Mount Desert Island on Little Cranberry Island. And what they did is they installed solar panels on their co-op. They installed it in 2019. And in this entry of the Solutions Library, you'll hear or you'll read about an interview that Island Institute staff conducted with the co-op manager about what motivated him and his co-op members to do this. And yes, it was economic, but it was also something that they thought that they could do. They're seeing the impacts of climate on their fishery, and this is something that they thought they could do to help mitigate the problem. So decarbonizing working waterfronts is not just a mitigation strategy for climate change, but it's also a way for these working waterfront businesses to adapt to the changes that are impacting their businesses. It can help them kind of stabilize energy costs and have those energy costs become more predictable. Another thing related to this in terms of decarbonizing the working waterfront is the big push towards electric motors for boats here in Maine. And so the Island Institute has been a leader in terms of understanding not just the greenhouse gas emissions of different fisheries and aquaculture sectors, but also helping them to deploy solutions. And one thing that we are very proud of and have led the state on is the implementation of electric outboards. And the next slide here is announcing something that we're hosting next week in Rockland. We're having a party because we've finally launched our very first electric boat, fully electric, a hull designed to hold an electric outboard. And we'll be celebrating. If you're around in Rockland next week, you can join us. But we're very excited to be showcasing this first boat out on the water. We hope it's the first of many. And so this is an example. We work with people in the fishing industry and the working waterfront industry who are early adopters for this kind of exciting technology and are willing to share their stories, good and bad. Like hopefully this is a really positive story, but we'll be learning from this early adopter about what's worked and what hasn't worked. So last summer we were installing these little trackers on aquaculturists out skiffs and tracking kind of the use cases of where could this type of technology work? We understand we're not there for the big lobster boats that we operate on the Maine coast. The technology is just not quite there yet. But for an aquaculturist who has an 18-foot Carolina skiff, is this a possibility? And so we'll be finding out very soon, but we think it is. Okay, so the next stressor, you can't see the headings, unfortunately, because of the Zoom bar, but it says changes in ocean acidification. So the next climate stressor that I'll be talking about is ocean acidification. This is caused by the uptake of carbon dioxide by the ocean, and I'll explain a little bit more of that, I think, in the next slide. But essentially what's happening is with excess carbon dioxide emissions, about a quarter to a third of all of those atmospheric emissions absorbed by the ocean. And so what the red line is basically atmospheric carbon dioxide. The blue line is seawater pH, and the green is seawater carbon dioxide. So you can see that seawater carbon dioxide is increasing as atmospheric carbon dioxide increases, and then we have that decline in pH. So remember, a decline in pH is an increase in acidity. If you look out into the future, projections similar to the ocean warming projections, they're not good. Ocean warming, we're predicting more increase with ocean acidification. We're predicting further decreases in pH depending upon the emission scenarios. So in large part, it's really all under our control, how much acidification we see going forward. So this slide is really, I won't walk through the chemical equations of ocean acidification, but essentially as CO2 is absorbed by the ocean, it creates an acid called carbonic acid that dissociates into different ions, and then we result in that decrease in pH. And unfortunately, the Gulf of Maine is uniquely susceptible to ocean acidification because for a number of reasons. Number one, cold water absorbs carbon dioxide more readily. Number two, colder, fresher water entering the Gulf of Maine from Canada, like that Labrador current that I showed in one of the opening slides, has a lower pH. We're very fortunate to have many freshwater rivers in Maine, but those big rivers that come into the Gulf of Maine, that river water is more acidic. And then because of the semi-enclosed shape of the Gulf of Maine, it increases the residence time of that more acidic water. So that's kind of the environmental susceptibility that we have in the Gulf of Maine. We've been identified as the most susceptible water body along the entire eastern seaboard, including the Gulf of including the Gulf of Mexico. Unfortunately, we also have an economic vulnerability because of our reliance on shell building species. So raise your hand if you've heard of ocean acidification before.
Yeah.
Pretty much everybody. And so what most people know, if they've heard about it, is it's going to impact things that grow shells most severely. So if you look at the title at the top of the slide, you can't see is the 2022 commercial Maine landings by X vessel value. Basically what this is it's a pie chart showing the percentage of value of different species of fisheries landed in Maine. And the take home point is that, yes, we land a lot of lobster, resulting in 68% of the value of our fisheries. But what I've circled here is these are all species that have shells or skeletons. So we've got lobster, obviously, the soft shell clam, the scallop, the oyster, the blue mussel, the hard clam. If you total it all up, 75% of Maine's fisheries by landings value are shell producing species. So these are species that will be impacted by ocean acidification. So if we were Alaska, which is also pretty susceptible to ocean acidification, and we had like a diverse fishery of finfish and other things that may not be as vulnerable to acidification, it wouldn't be as much of a concern. But because we're environmentally susceptible and we're heavily dependent on shell builders, it's a pretty concerning issue for the Gulf of Maine. So what are we going to do about this? This is a global problem. And so what you can't read here is that this slide is titled Potential for Marine Vegetation to Mitigate Coastal Ocean Acidification and Improve Shellfish Sustainability. So this infographic is something that I helped to design probably about 8 years ago when I started partnering with Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences, Atlantic Sea Farms, and Bangs Island Mussels. These are two aquaculture companies in Maine, to look at the potential for farmed sugar kelp to locally remediate ocean acidification through photosynthesis. I'm going to back up just one step as to why a community development organization is engaged in scientific research about ocean acidification. And it is because of one conversation that I had with a fisherman at an event that we hosted. I was talking to him about ocean acidification, understood that that was a threat to shell builders. At the same time, we're talking about helping lobstermen diversify into shellfish and seaweed aquaculture. And he said, why would I diversify into a shell fishery when you're telling me that ocean acidification is going to impact shell builders? So why would I, granted, lobstering is still a great business, but why would I diversify my fishing business into another species that's going to be, another shellfish that's going to be vulnerable to acidification? I thought, well, that's a really good question. We don't have the answer as to when a mussel or an oyster farm or an oyster farmer in Maine is going to see their business suffer because of these climate impacts. We don't really know at what point is that tipping point where it's no longer a good idea to do this type of thing. And is there possibly a local remediation strategy where you could kind of buffer those local waters? And so that's how this research began. And it started out with deploying instruments inside and outside of a sugar kelp farm off the coast of Chebeague in Casco Bay, and just testing the water. Can we measure a difference in the chemistry of the water inside the kelp farm versus outside the kelp farm? And the answer was yes, we could. We couldn't quite map the exact remediation halo because it's very much dependent upon the tides and how strong the current is in that location. But we could say for sure that the water chemistry inside that that kelp farm was less acidic than outside of the kelp farm. So the next question was, could a co-located mussel do better in that environment as opposed to the more acidic environment outside the kelp farm? And so that's where the partnership with Bangs Island began. And we outplanted small mussels inside the kelp farm and then varying distances from the kelp farm, and found that sure enough, those mussels that are growing inside the kelp farm have thicker shells. If you've ever seen a mussel aquaculture harvest, it's very rough. And so they're shoveling the mussels, they're putting them in metal processing equipment, and there's a lot of breakage. So you can imagine how much breakage would happen if those shells are just a little bit thinner or weaker because of acidification. And so mussel farmers started to see this as like, oh, this is actually a possible remediation strategy for my mussel farm. And so now this is a picture of, these are lines of kelp right here, and these are mussel farms, and this is off of Clapboard Island. This is Bangs Island Mussels Farm, and Bangs Island Mussels is now one of the leading growers of kelp in the state of Maine. They're growing kelp around their mussel farms, and this buoy here, underneath this buoy, are these ocean acidification measuring instruments, and this is me and two partners from Bigelow deploying those instruments. So for the last 3 years, we've been deploying the instruments at Bangs Island Mussels, the one of 2 mussel farms that's now surrounded by kelp, to help him decide, okay, where should I be growing this kelp exactly? Knowing the local currents, like what would be the best place to grow the kelp. So he receives acidification remediation, and then he also receives a spring paycheck because he does harvest that kelp. So it's another income for the business. So I won't spend too much time on this slide, but I mention it because there are a lot of potential climate services of farmed seaweeds, not just acidification remediation, but if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and you look at the ecosystem services of farmed kelp, they all ladder up to some kind of climate action. So whether that be nutrient remediation from the kelp taking up, or the seaweed taking up excess nitrogen and phosphorus, whether it be acidification remediation from kelp taking up excess carbon dioxide, or whether it be the kelp being used as food and replacing a more carbon intensive food source, or whether the kelp being used as biofuels or bioplastics. So there's lots of potential for the use of farmed seaweeds. And a lot of, also another thing that's being researched in Maine through Bigelow is kelp being used as a food additive for bovines, in this case cattle, to reduce their methane burns. Methane is one of the biggest contributors to climate change. So lots of advances in climate services of farmed seaweeds, and a lot of this work is happening in Maine, which is exciting. Okay, so the last climate stressor that I'll talk about is sea level rise. So we have 5 tide gauges in Maine. So we know the sea is rising. We can measure it, and we do so at 5 tide gauges that are operated by the United States Geological Survey. This is data that you can all pull up online. I selected the Bar Harbor tide gauge because it's sort of close to where we are. There's one in Portland that's been operated since 1912. I think the Bar Harbor one has been operated since 1947. I think we'll just pay attention to the figure on the right. And basically what this is showing is sea levels since 1940 up to 2023. And the blue line is showing that at this tide station, we've seen an increase in sea levels of 2.35 millimeters per year. That's over a century's time. And then more recently, we're seeing an increase of 3.54 millimeters per year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's actually 1.16 feet per century. And then what's important to see from this figure is that the slope of the red line is greater. So basically the rise is accelerating. So that rate of increase in the last 30 years is greater than the rate of increase over the last century. Okay. Unfortunately, that rate is expected to continue to accelerate. This is the sea level rise trend from the Portland tide gauge, and it's more or less the same at all of the 5. There's a little bit of differences between all of the 5, but this will give you an idea. And this is going back to 1912 to about current day. And then what the projections are showing, this is the intermediate scenario looking out to 2100. And this is the high scenario. And so the state of Maine, for a long time, the state of Maine wasn't particularly helpful in telling communities what they should be planning for. They've been talking about sea level rise, communities have been seeing it, but when it comes to actually doing something to your public wharf, if a community knew that it was getting flooded and they needed to raise it, they would spend a lot of time figuring out, do we raise it 1 foot? Do we raise it 3 feet? What's the life of this infrastructure like? And so much time would be spent on trying to figure out how much to raise it that it was a little bit distracting. So the state of Maine, as of a couple years ago, has adopted sea level rise planning targets. And what we have adopted is to commit to manage for the intermediate scenario, which is 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and 4 feet by 2100. And then consider preparing to manage for the high risk scenario, the high scenario, which is a consideration for high risk infrastructure of 3 feet by 2050 and 8.8 feet by 2100. So these are not insignificant numbers. And to help visualize, if you would ever want to torture yourself, you can go online and look at a number of different map viewers. This happens to be from a newly released tool by the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, who operates the Maine Climate Council. This is an interactive climate impact dashboard, and you can look at all sorts of climate indicators, from temperature to sea level rise to, I can't remember what else. There's a lot. It's a brand new, it was just released, I think, last week. There's also one operated by the Maine Geological Survey, and this is Maine specific data. And you can look out under different scenarios. So this happens to be Monhegan, and fortunately Monhegan is not hugely vulnerable. We all know the island, the topography is quite great with lots of rocky coast, but there are some problem areas under these different scenarios, particularly around that section of road up at the top of Fish Beach, where there's concerns about, and Swim Beach, where there's concerns about the water kind of overtopping that road and ending up into the meadow, which is the aquifer. So that's been an area of concern for sure for Monhegan. Unfortunately, other communities have a lot more concerns. For Monhegan, we don't have a causeway coming to the island, but for a lot of places in Maine, there's one way in and one way out. And this is an example of the Deer Isle Causeway. It's the only road to get to Stonington. It's the only road for all those lobsters that are landed in Stonington to get off of the island. And so there's lots of places in Maine where this is a problem. We're already seeing flooding at king tides or during storms. This is an example of what a consultant has come up with for Stonington. This is just a list of the most vulnerable roads in that one coastal community, how much they should raise it, and then some estimates of what it would cost. So then there's other types of infrastructure like wastewater treatment plants that are hugely vulnerable. They're typically built in low-lying areas. And this is just a chart showing which ones in Maine along the coast are most vulnerable to sea level rise. Booth Bay Harbor has had analysis done on theirs. The Wiscasset one is one that you can see right from Route 1 as you're crossing over the bridge. So there's been lots of critical infrastructure where vulnerabilities have been identified. And it's really the next step of like, how do we fix those problems? That is the huge conundrum. Working waterfront infrastructure, like this particular place on North Haven. This is a boatyard on North Haven that is continuously getting hit with flooding events from storms. That December storm that we had this year pretty much picked up their pier and put it back down again. So it's an example of a place that just keeps getting hammered. Unfortunately, some communities, it's their entire downtown that's built in a low-lying place. I live in the town of Bath, or the city of Bath, and we have one of the most vulnerable downtowns. Vinyl Haven's the classic example of a vulnerable island downtown where their whole down street is vulnerable to flooding, and they've been one of the most proactive remote communities to really address this problem, where they've done a ton of planning to identify what their options are for their downtown. Damascotta is another example of a coastal downtown that's heavily impacted. It's a bit of a success story here in that they are one of the first towns to receive federal funding to actually do something about it. And so that improvement of their waterfront infrastructure, I think, is underway, but it was awarded during the pandemic. Okay, so I mentioned a lot of climate stressors, and the Island Institute really focuses on rural and remote island communities. Typically, they don't have a ton of capacity in municipal staff, heavily reliant on volunteers. A lot of those areas also exhibit a high social vulnerability. So I'm not going to really get into this particular figure, but the point here is that a lot of coastal and remote communities have high social vulnerability, meaning they have high rates of poverty, lots of elderly people, maybe disabilities, lack of car access. There's different metrics to identify social vulnerability, but it's all mapped out. You could look at your community in Maine and see what your social vulnerability is. And unfortunately, a lot of those communities that have high social vulnerability also have very low capacity scores. And so you've got very vulnerable places that don't have a lot of capacity to respond to these climate events. And this is where the Maine Climate Council has been very useful. So that video you saw highlighted some of the work coming out of the Maine Climate Council. And this is the climate action report that was released called Maine Won't Wait, which you heard referenced in the video, came out in December of 2020. This was the scientific and technical subcommittee's report that helped to inform the Maine climate action plan. But one thing that came from the climate action plan, there's a lot of action going on. But one thing that I want to mention that's pertinent to this conversation is the creation of a program called the Community Resilience Partnership. And this is a program that helps these communities who don't have a lot of capacity enroll in a community partnership program and then become instantly, what's the word I'm looking for, able to apply for small grants of up to $50,000. So it's very easy to enroll. Actually, the next slide I'm going to show you, the Island Institute has served as a service provider for this program, helping communities enroll into the partnership and then become eligible for these climate action grants. And Monhegan was one of the first communities that we worked with in round one. And so one of the things you have to do to enroll in the program is to hold a community workshop and identify what your climate action priorities are. So what are your biggest concerns of your community? And Monhegan identified their water system safety, their breakwater, and the need for wharf upgrades. And they applied for a community action grant with the help of the Island Institute. And unfortunately, they weren't awarded. They were only the only community that we've worked with that wasn't awarded the full amount of their grant for reasons I won't get into right now. But and so they were awarded some money from the state to do an assessment of the Monhegan Water Company treatment facility. So as I mentioned, these are a few of the issues around climate that Monhegan is addressing. So here we've got the freshwater drinking supply. I'm sure most of you know about this far better than I do, but underneath the meadow, the public wharf and the breakwater that is being hammered by more intense and frequent storms. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to touch on was, and I'm going to breeze through this because we are about at 45 minutes, is just a success story from another island community that has done a great job of including their community in their climate action. And that's the community of Islesboro. And Islesboro, admittedly, is a fairly well-resourced Maine island. And so they have more capacity. They are part of the Community Resilience Partnership. They did not need us as a service provider. They didn't ask the Island Institute to help. After this next round of CRP, we were just awarded our final service provider grant. All 15 year-round unbridged island communities in Maine will be part of the Community Resilience Partnership, which was a big goal of ours, but we didn't help them all. We helped a lot of them, but Islesboro is one we didn't help with. That being said, we do have an Island Institute fellow on Islesboro, which is a recent college graduate who has been helping with their sea level rise committee on the island. We also have a former Island Institute staff member who runs their sea level rise committee. So they have a lot of capacity on Islesboro to address climate issues. And with that capacity, I just wanted to share with you what's possible. And so the issues facing Islesboro are this. So this is a really low-lying section of road right there that's already flooding. And when it does, it separates the island into two. And so emergency services are on one end, and then there's still a population of people on the other end. That's a big problem. They also have a historic lighthouse and a lighthouse museum, kind of like you guys do here, but yours is on top of a hill. Theirs is already being flooded. It's right next to their ferry terminal, which is also at risk. But because they have an iconic, I'm just going to advance all these. They have an iconic a lighthouse that is one of the most vulnerable pieces of infrastructure. They've kind of capitalized on that to engage the community. So what they've done is they've worked with this. They have a K-12 school in Islesboro, and they've engaged the little kids to do a sea level rise art installation. And they have shown this art installation. It's out at the Lighthouse Museum. They've engaged the high school kids to partner with the engineer from the University of Maine to install tide trackers, not just on the ferry terminal, but on the other side of the island too, to get a sense of exactly what their water levels are like on both sides. They've also hired, in addition to the Island Institute fellow that they have, they also hired a resilience planner as a consultant who has a background in marsh migration to take a look at the marsh that is next to that low-lying piece of road that I pointed out in the previous slide. So all this is to say, and they've accessed the $50,000 grant from the state to address that low-lying, the narrows is this low-lying section of road. All this is to say is that they've taken a very holistic approach to highlighting their vulnerabilities and have engaged all aspects of the community, from the artists to the school kids to the scientists. So I think it's a great example of what a small community can do to bring everybody into taking climate action. So with that, I'll leave you all with a call to action. And this is a Venn diagram by someone who I very much respect. It's Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. She is a climate scientist, marine biologist, and she has come up with what she calls this climate action Venn diagram. And it's really simple. And it allows everybody to figure out how they can contribute to the solution. And basically it has three components. It has one, you have to think about what you're good at. The next is to think about what work needs doing. And the last is to think about what brings you joy and satisfaction. And so her mom, I guess, who really likes to garden and likes chickens, this is her mom's Venn diagram. So what are you good at? Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson's mom, she's good at studying health and nature and raising backyard chickens. What work needs doing? Protecting food and water and local climate solutions. And what brings her joy is being part of nature and sharing nourishing food and deep conversations. And so what she's done is to create a climate victory garden and to convert her lawn into a small scale regenerative farm. And I thought this really resonated. I was having a conversation with someone from a Casco Bay Island about her son, who's a teenager, and she was saying to me, it's really hard to engage youth in this conversation. And I'm pleased to see some young people in the room here, but she said, I can't get my son, who's 16 or 17, to come to these climate action events and to feel like he can do something. He says, I don't have any skills that would be useful. And then in the same sentence, she said, but he's so interested in cooking and he's such a great chef and yada, yada, yada. And I was thinking, wow, my son could cook. I would be thrilled. And then I was thinking, well, he could cater, and Great Diamond Island has a very active climate action committee. He could cater the food for the climate action committee, and it could feature locally grown kelp or some other climate friendly food. And that could be his contribution. So he likes to cook. He's good at it. What he's doing, people need to eat, and people need to understand that there are foods that are better for the climate than others. And that would bring him joy. And that would be a thing that he could do to take action against climate change. So I think there's there's no excuse for not taking action. There's something that everybody can do that's meaningful. And so I guess I'll just end right there with one of my favorite photographs that our photographer at the Island Institute took just last month here in Monhegan is the Monhegan night sky. So thanks very much.
Can you get the lights? There's one question. Is there a program or projected solution for moving houses on the shore threatened by sea level rise?
Yeah, I mean, is there like a federally funded program? This is not
guess
my
so.
area of expertise.
I guess-
I'm not sure. I get a lot of questions about what private landowners can do here in Maine, and I really don't have a great answer for them until now. We have a lot of private landowners who are seeing their waterfront property erode. Yep, and we don't have a lot of state resources to help private landowners fund the solution. And so a lot of people just immediately think, okay, riprap is the only thing I can do. And they'll call a contractor, and that's the first step. So we're working with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute and some partners in the Casco Bay Islands, and we're going to be working with them to host a Living Shorelines Casco Bay cruise in September or October to showcase some of the experimental living shorelines that exist here in Maine. There's not a lot of them, but we have a great leader at the Maine Geological Survey named Pete Slavinsky. He's got several experimental bluff erosion strategies that are being tested and monitored to better understand whether those are feasible solutions and alternatives to riprap. They're a lot less expensive. It's just not clear whether they work or not. And riprap usually works for you, but not so well for your neighbor. And not everyone can afford that solution.
Do we have any questions here? Okay.
I was so interested in the kelp thing.
Mhm.
Is there one kind of kelp? Did you say it was sugar kelp?
Yeah, so
Are there different kinds?
there are definitely
Wait,
different.
repeat the question.
Okay, the question is, she's interested in kelp farming, and are there more than one species of kelp? So yes, the answer is yes. There's lots of different species of kelp. It's a brown alga. And right now in Maine, there's primarily one species called sugar kelp, and then there's like a variant called skinny kelp, which is actually a different species. They're both locally found here in the subtitle. There, you could probably, I don't know if you could, well, maybe you could find skinny kelp here. It likes really, really exposed shores. So you might find skinny kelp. I don't think anyone's ever looked for it on that side of Monhegan, but it may be there. So yes, those are the easiest species to grow right now, but people are experimenting with other species as well.
Thank you.
What's involved in growing them? How easy or hard is it?
What's involved?
What's involved in growing kelp? Yep. So I won't simplify it too much. I wouldn't say it's not too hard, but there is a hatchery phase that is being done by just a few companies. So the company that we're partnering with on that research is Atlantic Sea Farms. And they have my friend who is a phycologist, he did his PhD on seaweed, and he was hired by this company to be their seaweed like hatchery scientist. And so he goes out into the field and gets reproductive kelp, brings it back to the lab, and basically spores it, and then it will settle onto the baby kelps will settle onto like kite strings that they've wrapped around spools. And once it's hanging on well enough to that kite string, it's microscopic in size. And then the farmer, who often has experience working on the water, would kind of unroll that spool onto like a thicker line, like a lobster trap line that's like that diameter, half-inch maybe, I'm not sure. I'm not a kelp farmer, obviously, but so then they would unspool that and basically string out the kelp, the kite line along that thicker line. So it grows about 7 feet below the surface on horizontal lines moored by anchors with buoys. So it's like, imagine, usually they're about 1,000 feet long, and it's not uncommon to have like 7 1,000-foot lines about 7 to 8 feet apart. I could draw this way easier than trying to explain this, but anyway, so once it's seeded, it just grows by itself. It doesn't require any feeding or fertilizing or fresh water. It just grows, and it grows through photosynthesis, just like a land plant. And then it grows from microscopic when it's seeded on the line in November-ish to like 12 feet long when it's harvested in May, June.
Wow.
Yeah, so really the labor is like deploying the infrastructure in the water, seeding the farm, and then making sure your lines don't cross during the winter, which is no joke, doing this kind of work in Maine in the wintertime. I know, because I deployed those instruments and had to maintain them all winter long. And then the harvest is pretty labor intensive. That will take several days. But in terms of, it's much different than like going out every day, like catching like a wild fishery is. This is much more like a farmer where you're tending your crop.
For those of you who are interested in adult fishing, Sarah Redmond spoke last year, and she has very extensive knowledge about the whole aquaculture related to kelp fishing, and she also has some very good YouTube lectures that you can tap into easily. So I encourage you to check that out. She was a very knowledgeable and a very hardy woman who is aggressively pursuing really ways to protect the Maine coastal water and present who is by large aquaculture areas, and how to get local fisher people involved in thinking about possibly transitioning from lobstering as there is sea temperature change. So Sarah Redmond, check her out on YouTube.
Let's explain. Why don't we say that the recording of this talk will be on the website in a few days, couple of days, and we will also have a bibliography of what she's talking about. If you will send us a list to info@monheganassociates.org, we'll put that up with the recording, and you'll find that online in a day or two. Okay.
So that was Sarah Redmond, speaker from last year, who's a wealth of knowledge on seaweed farming in Maine.
Marvelous.
Yeah.
So I noticed that there are far fewer, in fact, no crabs. I guess we call them, the rock crabs, what I've always grown up calling them. There are no crabs anywhere. And I noticed fewer seagulls. Because it's one of the things they can eat at low tide, because they don't dive underneath the fish, they have to eat what's on the surface. And I'm wondering if that's been observed anywhere else, and if you think that's related to climate change. Is it anything specific?
I don't know. I have not heard of other people observing a decline in rock crabs, or seagulls for that matter. It doesn't mean it's not happening. I just haven't heard of that.
One this year.
Yeah, that's odd.
Very odd.
If you're used to seeing them in a certain place and they're not showing up anymore, that's unusual.
No, I haven't seen either.
And that's here.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know why that would be. I haven't heard that from lobster fishermen. They're still catching plenty of crabs in their traps. Less rock crabs, more Jonah crabs. And green crabs are certainly very prolific along the coast. Not so much here, I heard today from a fisherman. Yeah. But I don't know. I can't comment on why you're seeing locally fewer rock crabs, but that's concerning.
Well, we done?
Yeah. So any other questions before we sign off?
You want to take any questions from the people?
We did. We did. There was one, and we did that first, actually. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So
Is she? I
get
want to
those.
take those over there. So
Okay. Just do what you need to do. Sorry.
Could you-
Okay,
Could you?
thank you. No,
Well, I want to tell people what we have coming up.
Okay,
But first, I would like to give Susie a big thank you from all of us.
Thank you, thank you.
Can you mute everybody? And then just to remind everybody, we have 3 more of these talks coming up. The next one is next Thursday, same time, same place. It'll be with Jill Weber, who's a botanist from Bar Harbor, who is also a professor at COA, College of the Atlantic. Really interesting woman, wonderful botanist. She's here next Thursday, August 3rd.
What's the topic?
Botany. It's plants on the island. So she's a botanist. Yep. She's going to tell plant stories. August 3rd, Doug Hitchcox, who's a naturalist at Maine Audubon, and Paul Hitchcox's son will be out here talking about the future of Monhegan birds. As you know, I'm a birder out here. A lot of birders come out here in the spring and fall. Our bird life here is going to change as climate change affects the Monhegan habitat. And then August 13th, last but not least, Matt Rose and our own Danny Bates are going to talk about the Monhegan Island water system, past, present, and challenges of the future. So good lineup. Keep coming. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.